What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some unique and memorable games I have reviewed over the years because, frankly, I have reviewed hundreds of games at this point. I don't have the exact number, but somewhere between like 260 or 280, give or take. And the thing about reviewing that many games is that after a while, what really starts to stand out to you more than anything else are games that actually do something unique that you haven't seen before. And even if it's not literally unique in the sense that there are zero other games that ever do this, but because you have not experienced that thing before, it tends to stand out in your memory a bit, which is obviously kind of the idea with these particular games. And I think what actually makes that even more interesting is I would not really classify any of these games as like my favorites or anything. They are just games that I remember for a very specific thing that they did. And sometimes that's really fun, sometimes not. But in all of those cases, I certainly haven't forgotten about them, so mission accomplished, I suppose. With no further ado, let's actually dive into this though. So kicking it off nice and easy with the most recent title in the list by far, and that is actually the recent release of The Alters. And this game being unique is really something I tried to highlight in my review of it specifically, because on one hand, the actual gameplay of this particular experience is not like wildly interesting. It's a lot of like survival, base building type stuff that honestly you've probably seen in a million games. What does make it unique though is that the premise of it is that we are trapped on a hostile planet that we crash landed on in pursuit of some magic material that can speed up the process of growth in things. We're going to use that exact material to just make clones of ourselves, more or less, however with different memories than we have, making them effectively a different person. And a huge chunk of this game revolves around basically talking with these various versions of yourself and assigning them to various tasks in order to, of course, accomplish your actual goal of escaping this situation. And it's really just such a unique setup and the execution of it, alongside choices that actually matter, because, for instance, you can't actually see every version of yourself in a single playthrough, all kind of comes together to make an experience that I have not had in any other game. It was very memorable, and while I don't think it's going to take the top spot for anything necessarily for me this year, I would definitely say it's the most original game I've played in quite some time. Coming in at number 2 though, just to mention a game I have talked about previously in quite a few different places with Divinity Dragon Commander. If you've ever played Divinity Original Sin 2, you're probably aware of the Divinity franchise, but what you may not know is its most odd duck of a sibling, which is Dragon Commander. This game is bizarre. At its very core, I would say it has that just regular old real-time strategy gameplay. In a lot of instances, you'll run through various missions where you build up your side of the map, your bases, and you attack enemy strongholds, that kind of thing. If you've ever played an RTS, you pretty much get the gist of it. What makes this game really unique, though, is actually the story framing and the choices it brings up for you, because outside of these RTS battles, you actually have a bit of an empire to manage, largely through text events aboard your sort of flying fortress of a base. This is going to see you making actual policy decisions, deciding who to marry within the Divinity franchise here, which then, of course, itself has a whole bunch of different quests associated with it. And so what this game winds up being is a mix of like very standard real-time strategy gameplay and then attaching all of that to a very, very bizarre sort of narrative framing to all of it, with an especially large variety of various outcomes to individual phases and how you manage the overall empire. And some of that is even shown to you through like various news clipping reports. And for all of those reasons, while Divinity Dragon Commander is not honestly a game I would recommend to most people, if you do happen to play it, and especially if you manage a full playthrough of it, I would say it's almost certainly going to be a game you remember at the very least. Very, very odd game. But that does bring us to our third entry. I admit this one's a bit of a favorite of mine in the sense of just being like a really weird, enjoyable little game that you don't have to necessarily spend a lot of time with. And that is, of course, none other than Maneater. Not a terribly old game, but there is a high chance you've already forgotten about it, though it did release back in 2021. Maneater is pretty much what the title says, in the sense that it puts you in the role of a shark cut directly out of your mother, only to be tossed aside and have to fend for yourself immediately. You do what sharks do, which is, basically eat as much as possible, growing all the while, and as you encounter various activities, as you grow up as a shark, you start to earn various mutations that allow you to turn into a truly monstrous predator that will, of course, be fighting for dominance in various boss battles and everything, both with undersea creatures as well as taking on, like, shark hunters that are trying to kill you, if you get a little too crazy in tearing various beachgoers limb from limb. And honestly, just everything I described there isn't that terribly unique in terms of its gameplay either. It's really more about the presentation and how it depicts all of this stuff in a really over-the-top, almost sort of B-movie gore type of way that makes it even more interesting. In fact, the game did so well, they did actually put out a DLC for it called, I think it was like Truth Quest or something, that kind of leaned into all of the pollution and the mutations you yourself have been experiencing as this shark. You can learn a whole bunch of information about how there's been a whole bunch of like illegal nuclear waste being dumped here, which has been causing all the mutations in the wildlife, which is responsible for your mutations, but also a lot of the bosses you've been fighting. And it was a really funny little setup. But for all of those reasons, Maneater is incredibly memorable and a lot of fun, especially if you're just looking for something very silly to play. I'd recommend you give it a shot. You can regularly find it for pretty cheap, given its age. And it's a fun game to play if you can find it for under like $10, especially given that it's not a terribly long title. Now for our second to last entry here, I wanted to talk a little bit about last year's Slitterhead title. A bizarre game that sees you possessing various people in an attempt to fight off an invasion of Slitterheads, which themselves sort of infest people and turn them into these monstrous sort of praying mantis-like monsters. And a lot of the possession mechanics especially are really interesting in the sense that you can possess just random people, you get a buff for doing so to encourage you to rapidly switch between them, but then you also have your sort of like prime people, the companions and story characters you'll be with along the way, who are more receptive to the possession, which gives them extra powers when having done so. And also, doesn't usually result in their untimely death in some way, thanks to all of the monsters you are fighting with their powers. But that, in combination with some of the mechanics around tracking these actual Slitterheads down in order to fight them, was really, really interesting to me. Now, unfortunately, what I haven't said there, but you've probably seen at least a little on screen as I've been talking about this, is that it's a bit of a janky game that was also pretty expensive for what it is. Which is, I think, why the game did not do terribly well. But luckily, at least, as you could probably tell by its position on this list, it is nonetheless a memorable experience, which I suppose is just about as much as you could ask for given the risk this particular game takes. It's certainly the kind of game where I think if you sort of cleaned up the core experience, you could probably do something really fun with like a sequel if it ever gets that opportunity, but obviously my hopes are not terribly high there. But again, if you can catch this one on sale, I do think it is worth your time. But then, to wrap this particular video up, I'm going to end on an especially odd duck, which is none other than PowerWash Simulator. Because frankly, I think it's like 65 hours in PowerWash Simulator, and it's a unique game, frankly. So right away, there's not exactly a lot of games whose entire gameplay is centered around power washing various things. And honestly, just trying to explain to people the sort of pros of this game and how honestly really relaxing I find it in a strange way. But it's also the kind of game you explain and, everybody's response is like, wow, that's really dumb. And I've accepted that for what it is. But honestly, this game has had a tremendous bit of success. And I think a really big part of that is it's just a really great way to kind of relax, as it's not a terribly complicated game. You're basically just pressure washing everything if you'd believe it. But there are some choices to be made, like there's various material types and stuff, upgrades you can get to, of course, all your equipment to do this, and just some really basic progression. And all of that combined with meticulously cleaning with various attachments to make sure you've cleaned all of this place out is one of the more relaxing experiences I've ever had playing a game, honestly. And that is itself very unique, even if it's not necessarily unique in a way you might have thought, which I think might be why I enjoyed this game so much, because it's the kind of thing where you might go into it kind of writing it off as a joke, only to find that there is actually something really enjoyable about playing this, despite the fact that it is, literally busy work and chores. But that is as good a place as any to start wrapping this up, so I certainly hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.